Simone Biles, Noah Lyles, Michael Phelps, Adam Peaty, Nicola Adams, Louis Smith. What do all these people have in common? If you said Olympic athletes, you're not wrong, but that's not the answer I was going for here. What could it be instead? You guessed it, ADHD! Hello and welcome to Through the Noise Coaching. My name is Lee and I'm a leadership coach specialising in growing the career of driven mid to senior neurospices, and today I'm talking about ADHD, sport and elite sport at the highest level and the connection between them all. We hear a lot about ADHD and sport, about how exercise improves ADHD symptoms, and that is a big list of people that I gave you at the start who are Olympic athletes who also have ADHD. But how much of this is just me cherry picking examples, and how much of a link is there really? Well, I turned to the science, so let's find out. And as it turns out, there's not a huge amount of science. There's just not a lot of research done yet in this space, and the research there, some of it is dubious, or they just don't really get conclusions that they set out to prove. However, that's not the end of the video already. Thank you for watching. No, we're actually going to look at the science that is out there and look at some of the themes that are emerging that will hopefully develop as more and more research is done in this space. I wanted to share that I intended to do this video on neurodivergence in general in sport, and I was looking for things around autism, ADHD, dyslexia and so on and so forth. And actually there's not a huge amount out there outside of ADHD. There wasn't really anything on dyslexia. The only thing that I found out there on autism was basically just saying there was no correlation between autism and sport, other than, yeah, sport is beneficial for autistics, it makes them feel better, manages the symptoms better, all that kind of stuff. But that's not really what I wanted to look at for today's video. So unfortunately we are just going to talk about ADHD today because that is the only place that there's any research. Now I come into this topic as someone who is a bit biased because I do love sport in general. I've been doing formal sport in some way since I was 8 years old and have absolutely loved the whole journey. I've met so many amazing friends there, and actually a huge portion of us seem to be neurodivergent. I mean, from the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu I do, famously the community is full of autistic, and I met a fair few ADHDers as well. So is it just that I choose interesting sports, or is there more of a connection here? Neurospices, and especially ADHDers, just tend to have more hobbies, and we tend to be more dedicated to our hobbies, much more committed to them because we like hobbies more. And so it kind of makes sense that if you're going to go do a hobby, like sport for example, there's a higher chance that you might find some neurodivergence there. So with that in mind, we're going to look at both the pros and the cons of ADHD in sport, the effect of sport on ADHD itself, the actual real evidence out for that, and then we're going to look at the correlation between ADHD and elite level performance sport. So we're going to kick it off with part one, the negative parts of ADHD in sport. So the negative sides of ADHD in sport are probably not going to be too surprising for you to hear. We tend to get distracted more easily, we have harder time regulating our attention. I'm sure most of us can experience the ball just went flying past us and we were off in our own little world thinking about Pokemon or whatever it is that you were thinking about as a kid. I was thinking about Pokemon. Because we just have a hard time managing our attention. Emotional regulation can also be an issue, and one study found that boys with ADHD had a lot more trouble with aggression and disqualification than their neurotypical peers did. However, something that's really interesting is that while I found this paper referenced in more recent literature all to do with adults with ADHD, I didn't actually find any linkage between this aggression and actually adults with ADHD. And so I'm going to get into a little bit more about the benefits of sport on ADHD a bit later, but at this point it makes me wonder, is sport actually beneficial? Are these kids learning how to handle that emotional dysregulation through sport so that this isn't a problem when they get to adulthood? Studies also refer to impulsivity, which is more likely to lead to things like substance abuse, which obviously is not good for your sports career. They also mention that ADHD has comorbidities of depression and anxiety, and you don't need me to tell you why that can make things harder. Finally, I want to talk about ADHD and concussions, because this is actually one of the areas where the research is pretty thorough. And they found that ADHDers are more likely to have stronger concussion symptoms, they're more likely to have had a previous concussion, and they're more likely to be concussed during the season of sport. However, the paper, Neurodiversity in Elite Sport, a Systematic Scoping Review, is somewhat critical of this conclusion. They highlight that ADHDers actually tend to score worse on the baseline assessments for concussion, and that they refer to a meta-analysis that looked at all the studies around concussion, and they actually found that only 2 studies had something significant, and between them only had 21 participants, which is very low, and that studies designed to measure just this didn't really find any significance at all. I do want to see a lot more research in this space, because if we do genuinely suffer from concussions at a much higher rate and have a much harder time recovering, then that's really important to know so that we can do something about it. But the science is just not really there yet, even though it tries to be. Part 2, the benefits of ADHD in sport. While the inability to regulate our attention was listed as a con in the previous section, there's also an argument to be made for actually being a pro as well. And the reason being is that we're more likely to be distracted by things that are out of the ordinary, which might actually be something that is relevant to the game or the competition or whatever it is. We might be more likely to pick up something unusual that's happening and notice it before others. The difficulty with regulating attention as well leads to things like hyperfocus, where we get so thoroughly engrossed in what we're doing that we completely block out all distractions, presumably different distractions to those in the previous points. And this could be a benefit in sport, maybe even crucial to doing well at sport. Now, I read a lot of research on ADHD, and one thing that I find that is completely polarising among the academic community is whether they consider people with ADHD to be hardworking or not. Many papers point to our lack of conscientiousness and say that we're not resilient and all that stuff, but other papers, including one that I'm using as a reference for this video called "Do Athletes Have More of a Cognitive Profile with ADHD Criteria Than Non-Athletes?" really stress that ADHDers are incredibly hardworking, and that hardworking is absolutely fundamental to our sporting performance. The way I reconcile these two opposing views about whether or not we're hardworking is all to do with how you look at executive function and how you understand it. Because if you don't understand executive function, then it can look like we're not hardworking. However, I've looked at multiple studies and covered them in these videos around ADHD in the workplace, in entrepreneurship, and now in performance sport, that all say that ADHDers in their lived experience are incredibly hardworking, and that hardworking pays off. I mean, being a hard worker has been fundamentally part of my own self-image long before I was ever diagnosed with ADHD. But I'm digressing here and getting off topic. Let's just say that hardworking was considered to be a pro of having ADHD when it comes to sport. And finally, the last thing is our super high energy levels, and you do not need me to tell you why that is important to sporting performance. Part 3, the benefits of sport on ADHD. Earlier this year, I put out a video on how to improve executive function. And I don't mean how to do strategies to make sure that you executive function better. We talk about that in other videos, but the one I'm particularly talking about is how to improve your baseline executive function so you're working on a higher level. I'll link this video above here, but we're going to talk about that a little bit now. It broke down 4 conditions that are needed to improve executive function. Number 1, the activity should challenge a variety of executive functions in new and different ways. Number 2, the activity should be personally meaningful and relevant and inspire a deep commitment and emotional investment between the participant and the activity, and even towards other people like the instructor and other participants. Number 3, it should have a mentor or a guide who helps you on a personal level as well as a coach for the actual activity. Number 4, it will provide joy, reduce feelings of stress and loneliness, and inspire self-confidence and pride. When I look at this list, I can immediately see how that fits the above category. Working on staying calm under pressure, or emotionally regulating when you're losing or even when you're winning so that you don't slip up, or remembering strategies, responding to a life situation. All of these things exercise all 3 aspects of executive function in your match, whatever it is your sport has. Organised sports often have a coach who acts as a mentor or a guide. And if you're doing a sport that you love, of course it inspires commitment, it inspires pride and joy and all of that good stuff. So I can immediately see how sport fits that category of improving executive functions. And if you do go and watch the video, you'll actually find that martial arts was something that was listed as one of the best sports for building this, whereas exercise for just exercise's sake that didn't include all of this wasn't really so useful. In the paper, do athletes have more of a cognitive profile with ADHD criteria than non-athletes? They refer to physical activity having a benefit on inattention, hyperactivity and stress, and reducing feelings of anxiety, depression, poor impulse control, and I've forgotten what the last one was, but I tried really hard by counting them off my fingers. Let me check. Bad conduct. Physical activity as a whole was found to improve all ADHD symptoms and also improved individuals' overall attitude and personal development, cognitively and emotionally, as well as academic performance. Sport has stimulation, it has structure, it has continuous reward, all things that the ADHD brain loves. It has socialising, but socialising through an activity rather than socialising for socialising's sake. Exercise also increases dopamine and norepinephrine, things that are shown to be low in the brains of ADHD children and adults. In the study, they actually found that in high-performing youth athletes with ADHD, they actually experienced more negative ADHD symptoms in the classroom than they did when they were actually doing their sport, which could suggest that elite sport could be a good career opportunity for these people. And speaking of elite sports, part 4, how prevalent is ADHD in elite sport? So I've heard the statistic before that elite athletes are more likely to have ADHD, and while watching the Olympics earlier this year, I noted how many Olympians mentioned their ADHD and were very open about it. So I thought, let's actually go and do some research and find out what those numbers are actually like. And the statistics are actually a lot harder to come by than I expected. I was inspired by a pre-publication paper called ADHD Among High-Level Athletes and its Potentially Beneficial Role in Athlete Development. It was pre-published at the time that I wrote this. It might be out now by the time this video comes out. I've prepared these in advance. I could only access the abstract of this paper, but it made some bold claims, and one of those was that ADHD symptoms are prevalent at 4 times the rate of actual ADHD diagnoses or medical reports that have been shown in previous studies, and actually ADHD symptoms are more present in higher or mid-level athletes than they are in lower level athletes. And the study I mentioned earlier, where they looked at students involved in the Swedish National Sports Talent Programme, so among the most talented in the country when it came to sports, they actually found that ADHD symptoms were in a higher rate in the athletes compared to their peers who just weren't athletes, and that was especially prevalent in the classroom. The 2023 meta-analysis of neurodiversity in sport found that multiple studies had the results that elite athletes were more likely to present with ADHD symptoms. And finally, in a statistic that I found particularly interesting, a 2019 paper called Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder in Elite Athletes, a Narrative Review, looked at the therapeutic use exception for US Major League Baseball. Now, from what I understand, the TUE, as it's called, or maybe it's called something else, I don't know, I don't watch baseball, that lists all the drugs that are banned under the anti-doping agency, but the person has been given permission to be able to use them. Despite them being a banned substance, they have some permission that enables them to be able to use them and them not be considered as doping. Now, ADHD stimulants are on that list, so that means that Major League Baseball then actually publishes a list where you can see how many players are on ADHD stimulants. And so from the off-season of 2017 into 2018, all through the 2018 to the end of the 2018 season, we can actually see how many people are on stimulant medication. And that was 101 people, which makes up 8.4% of the population. By that I mean the population of baseball players, not the US as a whole, obviously. Now, depending on who you ask, 8.4% could be about right for the prevalence of ADHD. Actually, every paper I read that has a prevalence number has a different number, and they all just state it like it's fact, so make of that what you will. But actually, let's look a little bit more closely. This is the number of players who received approval to take their stimulant medication in their MLB. And I don't know what the rate of approval is, but I'm going to guess it's probably likely that at least one player maybe was told no. And so there'll be some players that want to take stimulant medication for their ADHD, but can't because they're not allowed. Now you add in the fact that not all ADHD medication is stimulant medication anymore. Now there is non-stimulant medication options available, so we have to include those players. What about the players of ADHD who just don't take medication at all? I don't take medication. There's a lot of us out there who are unmedicated. We need to count them as well. And then, of course, what about the population of players that are just undiagnosed and don't even know that that's an option for them? These people all count as well. So even if we take the upper estimate for prevalence in the community, which tends to top out at about 10%, then you've got to think, if you take into account all the people that were denied stimulant medication exemptions, that take non-stimulant medication, that don't take medication or don't know they have ADHD at all, that's probably more than 1.6%. So that's another study pointing towards ADHD being more prevalent in elite sports than it is the general population. Conclusion. So how do I conclude this video? Well, what we've learned is that although yes, ADHD has some negatives that can make sport a little harder, ADHD also has a lot of benefits that are useful for sport, and sport has a lot of benefits that are useful for ADHD. And at this point, it seems likely that ADHD is represented in elite sport more than the general population. Now, based on my audience statistics, I'm pretty sure that you, the viewer, are maybe a little bit too old to get into elite sports in this time of your life. So how is this relevant to you? Well, first and foremost, if you have a kid who has ADHD, then maybe you should try sticking them in sports. You don't know where it can lead, you know, and it's likely to be beneficial. But also, sport is all round good for you. It's good for your heart, it's good for your lungs, it's good for your bones, it's good for your muscles, it's good for your brain when it releases to all these feel-good chemicals that are there and all those endorphins. But it's also really good for your ADHD too. So go out there and find a sport that you enjoy and make the most of it. And if it happens to be judo or jiu-jitsu, maybe I'll see you on the mat. Just don't injure your finger like I have. Please like, comment and subscribe, and if you haven't seen it already, you might be interested in going back and watching my video on how to permanently improve executive function. Thank you for your attention today, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.